All right, objective 3, conduction pathways. So we're all talking about how that information is getting to our brain and from our brain. So we have a couple of objectives here. We want to name the components of a conduction pathway and list the features that are common to all pathways. We want to compare and contrast sensory versus motor pathways. Define a sensory pathway and describe its action. List the neurons in the sensory pathway chain and describe their different roles. Describe the three major somatosensory pathways. Define a motor pathway and describe its actions. Distinguish between an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron based on function and cell body location. And lastly, compare and contrast the direct and indirect motor pathways. So a quick overview of the conduction pathways. We have our spinal pathways are going to either be sensory or motor. So as we've continued a theme here, sensory pathways are going to ascend or go up towards the brain, and motor pathways are going to descend going away from the brain. So some common characteristics that pathways have. The cell's location. So axons are going to be in spinal cord tracts, like we saw before, with our white matter within the spinal cord. Cell bodies are in ganglia or spinal cord gray horns and brain gray matter. Each pathway for conduction is made of a chain of two or more neurons. So it's not just one big neuron that's going all the way up or down. You're going to have a couple different ones in a row. Pathways are paired, so there's going to be a left and a right track. And then most pathways are going to do what's called decussating, which is crossing over. So axons are going to cross the midline of the spinal cord so that the brain processes information from the contralateral side, just meaning that the right side of our brain is going to be working with information from the left side of our body and vice versa. There are some uncrossed pathways, and those are going to be working on the ipsilateral side of the body, meaning the same side. So right side, left side, left side. All right, so sensory pathways. These are the ascending pathways. They're going to be sending signals from the body's sensory nerves all the way up to brain, such as for proprioception, which is just like kind of our balance and knowing where we are physically, our touch, temperature, pressure, pain. So somatosensory pathways are going to carry signals specifically from the skin, muscle, and joints. Remember that somatic portion is all about those things that we can kind of control and are very like physical skin, muscle, joints kind of movement stuff. The viscerosensory pathways, remember viscera has to do with organs, so this is going to be carrying signals from things like our heart and our blood vessels and our intestines. Any sort of sensory pathway is going to have a series of neurons, right? That's going to relay that signal to the brain from the outside of the body or inside of the body. So there's the primary or first order neuron that has a peripheral ending. There's the cell body in the posterior root ganglion, and then an axon leading to a secondary neuron. And we're going to look at some specific pathways here in a minute. The secondary or second order neuron is an interneuron. So those are the ones that are talking in between different neurons, right? So they're going to receive that primary information and take it to a tertiary neuron or to the cerebellum. So the third or tertiary neuron is also an interneuron that receives secondary neuron input and extends it to the somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe of the cerebrum. So some specific sensory pathways. There are actually three major types of sensory pathways. This first one is our posterior funiculus medial lemniscal pathway. So it's both of those, posterior funiculus, medial lemniscal pathway. So this is all about signaling for what our balance is doing, our proprioception, our touch, pressure, and vibration with a 3-neuron chain. So just like we saw in the common example before. So the primary neuron relays signal from skin to brainstem, and that peripheral receptor has an axon in the spinal nerve, the posterior root, and the spinal cord. So within the cord, the axon is in the posterior funiculus. Either it's fasciculus cuneatus or it's fasciculus gracilis, and we'll see that in the picture coming up. In the medulla, the axon contacts a secondary neuron, so it's pretty long, it's going to move through. Once it gets to the secondary neuron, it's going to relay that signal from the medulla to the thalamus. The cell body in either nucleus cuneatus or nucleus gracilis of the medulla is going to be where we're going to find that. And the axon is then going to decussate, so it's going to cross over and join the medial lemniscus and then transfer, it's going to continue on with its little axon into the thalamus and contact a tertiary neuron. then that tertiary neuron is going to send that signal to the primary somatosensory cortex or the postcentral gyrus. So if we look here, it's much easier to kind of see when we can have a picture, right? So here we are in that first section there, that brain stem, where we're going to find the primary neuron, right? So we have our receptor over here, and we're going to see that it's coming through, and it's either, again, going to be that fasciculus gracilis or the fasciculus cuneatus, again, still part of the posterior funiculus, hence that first section of the name, right? It's going to contact the cell body of a secondary neuron in the medulla or the medulla oblongata. We're going to see it's going to decussate here. It's going to cross over sides and then continue on. You're seeing the super long axon coming up here to connect in the thalamus with that tertiary neuron. So again, we've got our primary, our secondary, and our tertiary neuron. And then that tertiary neuron is going to bring this up into the primary somatosensory cortex of the cerebrum, called the postcentral gyrus. All right, our second sensory pathway, the anterolateral pathway. This is for signaling those information coming from crude touch, pressure, pain, temperature, and again, it has a 3-neuron chain. So I'm going to skip kind of talking through this. Let's go straight to the picture. Much easier to kind of see how it's working there. So again, we have our primary neuron. It's going to come here from those horns right into that anterolateral section, and it's going to decussate again, crossing over. So it's actually going to hit that primary neuron. It's going to bring that information to a secondary neuron that's still there in the anterior area, and it's going to move up into here through that anterolateral pathway, right, more towards the front on the lateral side, and continue all the way up until it hits the thalamus. And that's where it's going to connect with that tertiary neuron, which again is going to bring information to the primary somatosensory cortex. All right, our third pathway, the spinocerebellar pathway. So this signals proprioception again with just a 2-neuron chain. The primary neuron is going to relay signals from the skin to the spinal cord, and then the secondary neuron is going to go ahead and relay that information from the spinal cord to the cerebellum. So this is, again, much shorter, and we can see that primary neuron here coming in. That's the purple one right here. And then we're going to see our secondary neuron in the blue, and we'll see how they're connecting to each other here in that gray matter area where the cell bodies are going to be found, and it's going to move on up and go straight into the cerebellum where it will go ahead and give information on our balance. All right, so you'll notice that the sensory pathways, again, there were 3, and we found that our posterior funiculus medial lemniscal pathway is going to be right here. Our spinocerebellar pathway, again, just that 2-neuron pathway, it's going to be right there. And our anterolateral pathway is going to be this little tiny bugger here and here. All right, so moving on to the motor pathways. These ones, of course, are going to be bringing information from the brain on down. So we're actually telling our body to do something from the brain. So controls effectors such as our skeletal muscles, and it's usually going to have at least 2 neurons. So the upper motor neuron is in the motor cortex and the cerebral nucleus or brainstem nucleus, and it's going to be the one contacting the lower motor neuron. Okay, so that upper motor neuron is going to be in the motor cortex, the cerebral nucleus or brainstem nucleus, and the lower motor neuron is in the cranial nerve nucleus or the spinal cord anterior horn, and that's going to be the one that's exciting the muscle. So we have 2 different types of motor pathways. We have the direct pathways and the indirect pathways. So the direct pathways we see here is going to begin with upper motor neurons in the primary motor cortex. And these axons are going to course through what's called the internal capsule and the cerebral peduncles. The axons are going to end in the brainstem or the corticobulbar tracts or the spinal cord, also known as the corticospinal tracts. So the corticobulbar tracts originate from facial region of the primary motor cortex, and the axons extending into the brainstem where they synapse with lower motor neurons in cranial nerve nuclei. Then those corticospinal tracts, right? We kind of had two different direct pathways there. They're going to descend from primary motor cortex through the brainstem into the spinal cord, and they're going to synapse on the lower motor neurons in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. The lateral corticospinal tracts have their upper motor neuron axons decussating within the medulla's pyramid, so it's going to cross over in the medulla pyramids, and the axons form white tracts in lateral funiculi and contact lower motor neurons. The lower motor neurons are going to innervate limb muscles for skilled movements. So all those skilled movements are happening from the lateral corticospinal tracts. And then our anterior corticospinal tracts are going to have those upper motor neuron axons forming white tracts in the anterior funiculi versus in the medulla's pyramids. They're going to decussate at level of the spinal cord segment and contact interneurons or lower motor neurons. So they're not going to decussate all the way up in the brain. They're doing it lower in the spinal cord. And then those lower motor neurons are going to innervate axial skeletal muscles, so that centerpiece of us. So we're going to see here our corticospinal tracts. So you'll notice that we're starting here in that primary motor cortex. They're going to move down. These are our upper motor neurons just moving down here through that white matter of the brain. And these are our corticospinal tracts, so anterior and lateral, just moving alongside each other here, going all the way down through that anterior portion there of the spinal cord, and then they're going to hit down here, and that's where we're going to find those interneurons, where we see that decussation happening, and then that innervation of the skeletal muscles using our lower motor neurons. All right, so our indirect pathways, those upper motor neurons are going to originate in the brainstem nuclei and take complicated routes to get to the spinal cord. So we have a couple different indirect pathways. We have the lateral pathway, which is going to regulate precise movement and tone in our limb muscles, and it consists of the rubrospinal tracts originating in the midbrain. The medial pathway regulates muscle tone and movements of head, neck, proximal limb trunk, and consists of the reticulospinal, tectospinal, and vestibulospinal tracts. Continuing with our indirect pathways, we have the reticulospinal tracts from the reticular formation, and they help control reflexes related to posture and balance. The tectospinal tracts from superior and inferior colliculi regulate reflexive orienting responses to visual and auditory stimuli, and then the vestibulospinal tracts from the vestibular nuclei of the brainstem help maintain balance during sitting, standing, and walking. So you'll want to notice, of course, that the differences between our sensory and motor pathways is those sensories are going to be moving things up to the brain, and the motor pathways are going to be bringing that information down to the muscles and different things that are going to allow us to respond to different stimuli, right? So you'll see there that we have these upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons that are making up our motor pathways. And then that we have those primary, secondary, and tertiary sensory neurons that are going to create the sensory pathways. All right, last but not least, a couple of questions. What types of sensory signals are processed by the anterolateral pathway? So remember, that's our crude touch, pressure, pain, and temperature. Next question, where are lower motor neurons located? They are located in the cranial nerve nucleus or the spinal cord anterior horn. Next question, which motor pathway contains axons that cross in the medullary and then help control skilled limb movements? And those are going to be our lateral corticospinal tract, a part of the direct motor pathways.